Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Tarjei Vesaas' 1957 novel, The Birds, translated from the Norwegian by Michael Barnes and Torbjørn Støverud. I picked up this book on the recommendation of the booktuber Celia, who recommended I read it after I mentioned that I read The Ice Palace, and I'm really glad that I read this book. This novel, for me, stands alongside John Williams' Stoner as the closest a novel can come to perfection. Everything from the structure of the novel to its stunning language to the meticulously crafted images and metaphor are all really perfect in my opinion. Further, the emotional force of this book is not to be messed with. Seriously, I was not ready for how sensitive, empathetic, and just emotionally intelligent this book really is. I'll try not to spoil too much here, as I think it should be a crime to spoil the experience of reading this book. But in this video, I want to talk a bit about how this novel so successfully examines the psychological interiority of our protagonists, as well as how it depicts the natural world in which they exist. But to start, for those who aren't familiar with Tarjei Vesaas, I'll give a little bit of background on him. Vesaas is perhaps the most famous and most influential Norwegian author of the 20th century. I mean, he's really up there with Ibsen and Knut Hamsun and Sigrid Undset as some of the most important writers of Norwegian, full stop. He's probably a bit more well known for his novel The Ice Palace, and I realize that this might be a minority opinion here, but I do think that The Birds is actually a bit of a better novel, in my opinion at least. His books are all quite realistic and naturalistic and focus on rural life in Norway in the mid-20th century, and a lot of his books are borderline allegorical. Further, he actually wrote in Nynorsk rather than Bokmål, which is quite rare, as Bokmål is still kind of the standard dialect of Norwegian and was, at least in the mid-20th century, sort of considered the city dialect of Norway. This is to say that he's kind of a modernist in a lot of ways, but while modernists tend to focus on city life and how that leads to alienation and all the sorts of things that modernists are interested in, Vesaas is usually focused on the rural and on nature, making him a sort of romantic modernist or naturalistic modernist, if such a thing exists. And Vesaas writes in a very unadorned, simple prose style that I've really just come to love with Nordic authors. I think where Vesaas really shines, though, is how this, again, very simple style is used to so effectively explore the human psyche and, importantly, the natural world. These seem to be the two most important topics for Vesaas in his novels, and what he does so well, at least in the stuff that I've read by him, is fuse these two things, the natural world and the human interior, together. And this is exemplified and executed, I argue, perfectly in The Birds. The Birds is about a brother and sister named Mattis and Hege, who are both right around the age of 40. And they live together in this remote cabin near a lake in Norway. Their relationship is really important for this book, but what's really at the center of this novel is Mattis and his thoughts and emotions. See, Mattis is cognitively challenged. He has an intellectual disability, and because of that, he has a really difficult time understanding how and why people think and act the way they do, and this affects him and his sister greatly. Materialistically, this affects them because, well, Mattis can't really work. Throughout this novel, he picks up small jobs, but for one reason or another, he can't really maintain them, primarily because he can't focus on a single task for too long. And this means that Hege has to bring in the money. But of course, she also has to stay home and take care of Mattis. So she stays at home and knits all these sweaters. More importantly, however, though, is how this affects Mattis psychologically. He knows that he's different, and he knows that people view him differently, but he can't change any of that. And people are, well, awful, with a few bright exceptions, so they're not going to change anytime soon. Mattis complains on more than one occasion that people always misjudge the size of his ears, as they don't seem to realize that he can hear them when they're behind his back calling him all sorts of bad names. And even in the first chapter, he has to remind his sister Hege to talk to me like you talk to other people. What makes this book so moving for me is Vesaas's intimate and empathetic portrayal of Mattis, as well as Hege and their sibling relationship. I actually thought that their sibling relationship is incredibly well wrought. I feel like we don't see that many really well-written sibling relationships in literature. And Hege herself is a fascinating character, as she has to effectively ostracize herself from the community and take care of Mattis. But anyways, we get all of this beautiful interior psychology that is embedded in the language and imagery of the natural world. Indeed, the predominant metaphor of this book is clearly birds, which Vesaas uses to so effectively connect to Mattis's interiority. Towards the beginning of this book, Mattis witnesses a great event that really affects him. At that moment, the unexpected happened. This side of the wind, it is still. He had just been thinking as he stared towards the two aspens and the evening sky. Something was filtering through the treetops. It was so clear he felt he could see it. No wind, just something filtering through. And on this side, it was so still that not a leaf on the other aspen trembled. But suddenly came a tiny little sound, a strange cry, and at the same time he could just make out quick flapping wings in the air above him. Then came more faint calls in a helpless bird language. It went straight across the house, but it went straight through Mattis as well. A wordless excitement arose inside him. He sat there, wide awake and confused. Was it supernatural? No, anything but, and yet. It was a woodcock that had flapped over the house, and the woodcocks didn't do that sort of thing by chance, not at this time of day. A flight had begun over his house. And Mattis becomes obsessed with these woodcocks that just began flying directly over his house. Woodcocks aren't supposed to change their flight pattern, I believe, though I'm not an ornithologist. And to him, this must mean something. It must mean that things are about to change, right? And of course, to us, the readers, this also must mean something, right? I think someone could, and probably has, to be fair, make some really interesting arguments about how this book works as a sort of meta-narrative on the process of reading, as Mattis is constantly reading the signs of the natural world, just like how we read the signs and symbols of this novel. And anyways, he becomes so obsessed with this phenomenon that it really begins to destabilize his life. He won't stop nagging Hege about it, and she tries her best to temper him a bit. But he stays up at night just to witness the miracle of the woodcocks flying over his house. One night, he stays up late and watches. That evening, he sat on the steps, uneasy, fidgeting nervously with all his fingers. Hege had taken the risk and gone to bed after all. The time came for the birds. There was his cry, and there came the wings, flapping helplessly somehow, beating quickly. The wings were high up in the mild night air, but at the same time they touched the very center of Mattis's heart. The soft, dark touch of something beyond understanding. It spread right through him. Me and the woodcock, sort of, ran his formless train of thought. Throughout this book, Mattis is constantly trying to connect to other people, some who do understand him to a degree, like his sister Hege, and others who really just wish that they could ignore him. There are these wonderful scenes of Mattis working in a turnip field with an old farmer and this young couple, and another of Mattis getting stuck on an island in the middle of a lake after a hole appears in his boat, and he has to wait until these two young girls come to rescue him. And I won't go into too many details again because I don't want to spoil this, but in both of these scenes, Mattis is so self-aware of how the people around him are reading him and his sort of performance that it really just makes for heartbreaking literature, as you're just waiting to see whether these people will choose to try to understand him or if they will ignore him or scorn him. And in these cases, though, Mattis can't stop thinking about how he is entirely different from them, how he isn't clever like they are. He obsessively refers to other people as clever and to himself as not clever. Again, though, this penetrating gaze into the thoughts and emotions of Mattis are inextricably linked to the natural world, and the two really become one. One day, Mattis wakes up, and it notes that Mattis was full of the woodcock. He can't stop thinking about them. And after begging Hege to go with him to watch them and being refused, he goes and does it himself. And we get this wonderful scene that I'm going to read in full, though it is a bit long, but I really think it's worth reading out. But inwardly Mattis was bursting with song, him and the woodcock. He felt an urge to walk through the little wood, right underneath the invisible streaks in the sky. That was his path, a path full of joy. He wasn't disappointed this time either. After a little while, he had to stop. "You are you," a voice inside him seemed to be saying. At least that was what it sounded like to him. It was said in the language of birds, said in their writing. He was standing by a dried-up patch of bog right underneath the woodcock's path, standing looking spellbound, reading a message or whatever it was that had been left there for him. In the smooth brown surface of the marshy soil were the faint imprints of a bird's feet. A number of tiny, deep round holes had been dug up as well. The woodcock had been there. The deep holes had been made by the woodcock's beak, which it thrust down into the ground to dig up morsels of food, or something, just to prick out messages. Mattis bent down and read what was written, looked at the graceful dancing footprints. That's how fine and graceful the bird is, he thought. That's how gracefully my bird walks over the marshy ground when he's tired of the air. You are you. That was what was written. What a greeting to receive. He found a twig and pricked an answer in the empty space on the brown surface. He didn't use ordinary letters. It was meant for the woodcock, so he wrote it in the same way as the birds. The woodcock's bound to notice it next time he's here. I'm the only one who comes here, and the only one who writes. This bird message and the language of the birds is so interesting because, is the bird anthropomorphized by Mattis? Or are Mattis's desires avismorphized, anyways, by the bird? This is such a romantic, capital R romantic idea too, that nature generally, and birds specifically, are sorts of messengers, right? They are signs that should be read. That is, there's something really eco-critical going on here, and in many more scenes throughout this book, as Vesaas isn't interested in only the Anthropocene, but the larger ecology in which his characters exist. Mattis is rejected by human society, but accepted into the sort of natural world in which he wanders. A portion of this novel follows Mattis as he takes up the job as a ferryman on this lake, even though there are never people to ferry. In some ways, Mattis becomes a sort of wild man, or a natural man, which is kind of opposed to what we would call civilization. And as noted earlier with the readings of birds, the natural world around him affects his worldview, and he perceives everything through the symbolism and the language of nature. For example, the book opens beautifully with this line, Mattis looked to see if the sky was clear and free of clouds this evening, and it was. Then he said to his sister Hege to cheer her up, "You're like lightning." And a bit further down the page, he explains why he chose to say that she was like lightning. It says, "It was using the word lightning that he found so tempting. Strange lines seemed to form inside his head when he used it, and he felt himself drawn towards it. He was terrified of the lightning in the sky, and he never used the word in hot summer weather when there were heavy clouds, but tonight he was safe." Like the birds, lightning is a really important motif throughout this whole book, as it both terrifies and fascinates Mattis, as it should probably both terrify and fascinate us. In a lot of ways, Mattis is so relatable, even if you're neurotypical. His loneliness and alienation from other people, as he finds it so difficult to convey his emotions, is something that I think we can all at times, hopefully not always, but at times relate to. I think Vesaas himself actually said that of all of his characters, he has the most in common with Mattis. Mattis desperately tries to fit into society, but he's unable to, both because he doesn't think that he can and because, well, people don't let him. They think that his inability to communicate comes from the inability to think properly, though of course everything that we read in this book shows that he has a very deep and very thoughtful interior life. And this contradiction, the one between the thoughtful, philosophizing voice that reads all of this beautiful imagery and symbolism of the natural world around him that we read in this book, and the voice that other characters hear, which is a voice that finds it difficult to express his thoughts in a manner that other people could understand them. This contradiction is why this book is so beautifully heartbreaking. And the ending, man, I haven't been hit by a book like this in a really long time, but I think I'll just stop there for now. The Birds is such a thoughtful and empathetic look at this man that really just makes you want to go out and be kind to every single person that you meet, because you really never know what's going on inside their heads. But do let me know what you think of Tarjei Vesaas or The Birds. I'm interested to see how many other people have read Vesaas and what they think of his works. But for now, thanks for watching.